I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathering today, the Palawa people. Today we are meeting across Lutruwita, or Tasmania, and we have an audience tuning in from various locations online. So I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which you are all listening. On behalf of everyone, I would like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, as well as the Tasmanian Aboriginal community who continue to care for country. I recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in their forcible removal from their lands. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. Hi and welcome to Working on Water, a collaborative project between That's What I Call Science and the Royal Society of Tasmania for National Science Week 2020. My name is Hannah McCleary and I'm joined by Mibu Fischer, an early career researcher at CSIRO's Oceans and Atmosphere Tropical Coasts team. As part of our Science Week event, we are featuring 4 women working in marine science. I'll be talking with Mibu about her journey in marine science and her experiences as an Indigenous woman working in STEM. Thanks for joining me, Mibu. So your role at CSIRO is as a marine ethnoecologist. So can you explain what that actually involves for people who might be unaware, like myself?
Yeah, so a marine ethnoecologist is basically somebody who studies the marine domain, coasts and oceans, but specifically looks at the linkages between cultures and the environment. So I look at Indigenous cultures and what their links are with the coasts and oceans.
Awesome. So what does a normal day look like for you at work?
Oh, a normal day at work for me is pretty boring. Sitting at a desk, doing lots of meetings and reading papers. But the parts that I like the most about my job are when I'm out in the field and doing workshops with communities. So I actually get to engage with community groups and know their stories and their history, and yeah, that's the part I like the most.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I know you have a specific interest in actually strengthening partnerships between Western and Indigenous knowledge systems. So do you want to sort of let us know why you think that is so important, not just to yourself, but for Australia in general, to sort of strengthen those connections?
Yeah, so from my perspective, and this can get a little bit philosophical, but we kind of have 2 different worldviews. So we have an Indigenous worldview, which is more holistic, and then we have a Western worldview, which kind of looks at things from a top-down approach, really hierarchical. And so I think it's really important to be able to merge the 2 together, because without doing that, I don't think we'll be able to move forward sustainably, because the Indigenous worldview really was and continues to be a very sustainable model. And unfortunately, due to colonisation and a lot of other things, that model has been left aside. Even though people are still practicing it, it's not within the mainstream system and it's not supported by a lot of governance around the world. So that's why I think it's important.
Yeah, it really is. So maybe can you give us an example of some of these sustainable practices that have been lost that we're actually trying to bring back?
Yeah, okay. So one of the really big examples not related to the marine area is fire management. And because of the bushfires in Australia at the start of the year and the end of last year, there's been a huge push for integrating Indigenous fire management into our Western systems, and finding those specific management practices along the coast and oceans has been quite difficult, because the coastal areas around Australia are very populated, and so a lot of communities were pushed off country. However, those practices are still there and they're still known by community members, but it's re-establishing that trust between Indigenous people and science and management as well, and being able to actually work together to do that. There is examples overseas where this has happened in Canada. So in Canada, they've actually been able to work with 17 First Nations groups with the government, and the government has specifically done that in mind to use their traditional knowledges and practices to incorporate it into the marine management plan. And so we're hoping that that type of management strategy will be able to be seen in Australia, but the differences here are our governance structure and how that can work. And it also differs to the way people work in New Zealand because they have a treaty and we don't have that here in Australia. And so even though there's international examples of this happening, it doesn't exactly translocate into the Australian context that easily. Okay, so there is an example in Western Australia where the traditional dugong and turtle management has been utilised with CSIRO scientists. And so the CSIRO scientists work with the traditional owners to do dugong and turtle monitoring surveys because the traditional owners know the habitat and the patterns of these animals and where they're located and what their historic numbers have been. And so yeah, they work with CSIRO scientists to do that, to monitor it for the future.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think it's really important to sort of look to other countries and see how well they've, you know, implemented their ideas and how they've been able to communicate with their Indigenous populations like New Zealand and like Canada. I think we can learn some really valuable things.
Yeah.
So what factors do you think actually make it difficult to implement Indigenous knowledge systems here in Australia, you know, that are different to what's going on in Canada or what's going on in New Zealand?
Yeah. So I would say it's not any different to what's happened in Canada or New Zealand, but the biggest barrier would be around colonisation, globalisation and agency. So agency is in the ability for people to enact change within their communities. The remoteness of a lot of these communities and the misunderstandings and mistrust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia. And unfortunately, the continued racist culture within Australia also would play a big factor in that. And it's just, unfortunately, ignorance and that our schooling system has failed ourselves and others in better understanding the true meaning of Indigenous knowledge and how that can contribute to everybody in Australia as a public good service.
Exactly, and how important it is as well. I think that's really, you know, misunderrepresented in our education system.
Definitely.
So Mibu, how did you start your career at CSIRO?
So I started my career at CSIRO in my second year of uni, and I did a cadetship program, which meant that CSIRO paid for me to go to university. And then in the school holidays, I would work for 3 months at CSIRO in Queensland and got some work experience. And I just kind of hung around with them until they made me permanent.
Yeah, I've got experience with the cadetship program as well. I'm currently doing that here in Hobart. And it is a really, really valuable program, you know, to give students that hands-on, you know, industry experience while they're still studying at university and being supported in that way. So I think it's a really valuable opportunity, and I don't think opportunities are, you know, given enough exposure for students. And I don't think enough students are aware of these opportunities, so it's really important to sort of, you know, spread the word of those.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So actually, as part of your work at CSIRO, you were able to take part in a voyage on the research vessel Investigator. Do you want to tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, so in October 2019, I did a transit voyage from Brisbane up the coast across to Darwin, and as part of that voyage, my role was as part of the Office of Indigenous Engagement, and so I was really there as someone to look and see where the Marine National Facility, the group who looks after the RV Investigator, and identify opportunities where they can improve in their Indigenous engagement or in things towards implementing CSIRO's Reconciliation Action Plan. And so I did that, but at the same time, I also got to do some cool science stuff, which was great.
Awesome. What were a few projects that you did on board?
One of the most interesting projects on the voyage was with Geosciences Australia and Australian Marine Parks, and they were looking at the seafloor in the Westall Island Marine Park. And part of that footage actually picked up a sacred site, which used to be a billabong before the sea level rose.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was really cool. And then when we got to Darwin, another colleague from Australian Marine Parks and I actually went and met with traditional owners to get their permission to use that footage because it was a sacred site. And even though we're not allowed to know the story behind that, showing them that footage and seeing their reaction was a really special moment.
Yeah, that's great. So do you want to explain a little bit for some people who might not be aware why we can't know the story behind it and why it's important to have those protocols and, you know, respecting communities and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so in this particular community, a sacred site, there's different, well, not just that community, but in a lot of communities, there's different layers of knowledge. And as you move up in your age or as you become initiated, there's all different levels of initiation, and that's what determines who's allowed to know what about specific areas in nature. And it just so happens that this location is one where you have to be quite highly initiated, an elder, to actually know the stories behind that place or even have been to that place. And the people that we visited in Darwin who were from Wessel Island, they actually had a recorded story, and I didn't hear it, but they told us that her father had actually recorded a story of that site that they keep for those people who are allowed to know. Yeah. So it was really special.
Yeah, that's incredible. Have there been any obstacles that you have had to overcome as an Indigenous young woman in the marine research field?
Yes. So I would say the general ones that many women can associate with in being in science. And in marine science, it's a little bit better than other areas. There's a few more women around who you can use as support systems, but you're still in that male-dominated space. And then as an Indigenous woman, there's an extra layer almost around cultural integrity, where the community, because they know you're an Indigenous woman, they kind of expect a little bit more from you. Which puts a lot of pressure on yourself, as you may come to realise.
There's definitely a big responsibility there.
Yeah, and I also find because there's so few of us, we're always getting called upon to do things at the corporate level or trying to talk against governance structures and things like that. So yeah, it's hard to do just science if you're passionate also about trying to change the system, because you do kind of get pulled in all different directions. Yeah, but it is important in the long run. Yeah.
So do you have any advice for our non-Indigenous colleagues and peers on how they can actually support us as Indigenous women in the STEM fields?
Yeah. So I think I would start by saying educate yourself, and there's easily Googleable, is that a word? I'm using it as a word. You just type in, you know, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science, start with Darkie News, start with Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia by Anita Heiss. There's a lot of resources out there, and kind of, as difficult as this might be to say, stop asking us questions, because you can Google a lot of those answers. For the questions that you obviously can't Google, that's fine, but it just adds to that drain, and always constantly being asked questions and taking away from our actual work. But I also think it's really important to also start to question yourself when you're doing projects, and questioning, do I need somebody who's Indigenous on this project? Should it be co-led by an Indigenous person? Who are the Indigenous people in the area that my project's in? Do I need to contact them? And not always go to the only Indigenous person in your team. There are other people who are non-Indigenous that work in this space who are more than happy to share their experiences. It's just finding those community of practice which exist. CSIRO has a lot of community of practices when working with Indigenous engagement in Australia. In being an ally, there's like moments when you have to be silent and allow those minority voices to come through, but then you also need to make sure that when you have to have a voice because their voice is not going to be heard, then you need to have it. And often it's the times when you're going to change the system.
So being an Indigenous woman myself, I am part of the first generation in my family to actually attend university, which has been a really insane and sort of isolating but also exciting experience at the same time. And this is actually the case for a lot of my Indigenous peers at university. So I know that this is the case for you in that you're the first Indigenous woman in your family to go to university. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that experience and, you know, how you found that?
Yeah. So I didn't know I was going to do marine science at university. I thought I was going to be a police officer and go and do a human services and justice degree, and changed my application last minute. And moved away from home interstate to go to university, and as the first Indigenous person in my family to go to university, it was quite daunting. No one was really able to relate to my experience, and even now I don't have any other family members who have been to university or desire to go to university, so I do relate to you when you're saying it's an isolating experience. But it's great because you also get to meet other passionate Indigenous women and young men who want to work in academia and understand the Western science system as well as the traditional system if they grew up in their community.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I know that, like you said, you wanted to be a police officer. I actually wanted to be a paramedic when I started, so it's crazy the directions that you're going. But I don't know about you, but for myself, I'm super happy with where I'm at, and I think that I completely made the right decision.
Oh, me too.
Definitely, yeah. So as for the future of your career, what are you most excited about? Opportunities coming up or things that might be on the horizon in the future?
Yeah, so, well, once COVID passes, I'll be excited to getting out and doing some more workshops again. We have the potential to do some trans-Tasman, so with New Zealand Indigenous work, and also hopefully looking into the future, getting to work with some colleagues that I met at the end of last year from Canada and Taiwan and Finland and Greenland. So we wrote a paper actually for a Future Seas 2030 project, and I led the Indigenous chapter, which really gave a voice to Indigenous communities worldwide in how they're impacted by climate change, because a lot of the time those voices aren't given a space in academia, and this was a really great opportunity for that to happen. And we also were able to give some recommendations on how we think moving towards a more Indigenous worldview will help towards sustainability into the future. So I'm looking forward on growing that work and getting to know more about what Indigenous communities have done in the past and how that can help us now and into the future.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. Can you tell us a little bit more about the workshops that you do with Indigenous communities and how that works and that sort of thing? Yeah,
so depending on the aim of the project, we might get fishermen in the room or we might get elders in the room, and we just talk most of the time about what they'd like to see. So it's kind of like almost future scenario building workshops, and you have to be really careful around what information you collect from them around Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights. But that information can then be mapped and then given back to the community to help them in the decision-making process around what's going to happen in their area. So in Papua New Guinea, when I was over there a few years ago now, we did like participatory mapping. So we brought in maps from our Western science world and said, this is where your the land where your economy is, this is the land where you value, this is the land where this happens, and we kind of merged them all together, and they used these maps to say, oh, okay, so we need to put this here, we need to put that there, and it's all a very hands-on verbal experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's really important to have Indigenous people like yourself on the teams that do that sort of work, because for many people in community it can be sort of difficult to understand and to sort of, have, it can be
I know what you mean, and it's difficult to acknowledge it sometimes when you do go into a meeting or a workshop and they find out that there's an Indigenous person on the team, and there's just that instant connection because you know that understanding with each other, that you don't have to explain about history or any of those things, because there's just that innate understanding of what you've been through as a people, and it makes it much easier. And it doesn't matter what country you're in, because I've had that experience in the Solomon Islands, PNG, with people from Canada, Finland, Taiwan, Greenland. That's
amazing. So just to wrap up, do you have any advice that you would give to young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who are considering pursuing study or even a career in the marine science field?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that I would say, even if it's not marine science, study what you want to learn about, because I definitely wouldn't have finished uni if I did human services and justice. And I'm still into marine science now, and that was 10 years ago that I graduated. And just don't listen to what others are doing. Yeah, just do what you want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Having that passion sort of really drives people, and I think that that's one of the most important things to have.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Working on Water, a collaborative project between That's What I Call Science and the Royal Society of Tasmania as part of National Science Week 2020. For more information about That's What I Call Science or the Royal Society of Tasmania, head to their website or social media channels using the links provided in the episode description.